Good evening. I am Richard Urban, the host of The Rich Urban Show. Thank you for joining us for this installment on podcast and video of The Rich Urban Show. Tonight's episode is The Great Fraud, the COVID-19 Agenda, Part 1. Right now, we are in a state of spiritual emergency. I know many people would say we're in a state of physical emergency, but actually we're most of all in a state of spiritual emergency. So in this series, we're going to be examining the COVID-19 agenda. So right now we're having a crisis, I believe, like none, certainly we've never experienced in our lifetimes, maybe in the lifetime of our nation. Will we have the wherewithal to overcome the current onslaught that is coming? An onslaught of repression, of denial of religious freedom, freedom of conscience. You may be aware that in many states, churches are not allowed to gather. We know that Pastor Rodney Howard-Browne made a point in Florida, in Tampa. He was arrested. We know that more egregiously yet, in New York, Mayor Bill de Blasio has said that if churches don't shut down or any house of worship, he will close them permanently. I guess he is now God, little g, of New York, or the God of this world, as it says in the Bible. In other countries like Philippines and India, orders have been given if people don't cooperate with stay-at-home orders, they will be shot. So this is a state of unprecedented crisis. Now, the mainstream media would have you believe that it's a crisis of hordes of people dying. Well, we're going to look at that in this series, and we're going to do a total, including this introductory segment, of 8 segments for the next 8 days. I believe this is a crucial time, this next week, 8 days, leading up to the commemoration of Good Friday and then Easter, is a critical time in our nation. We're going to be looking at what are the real statistics of deaths in COVID-19 cases. Which data can be trusted? That's going to be episode 2. Then, episode 3 is what are the real number of deaths? So there are deaths reported, but what's the real number? We'll look at that. We'll look at historical data for deaths as well. Historical data for hospital visits as much as we can find out. And anecdotal data as well. The 4th installment will be what are the reasons or motivations for misreporting fatalities in each or different countries or states, because there are vast differences in the rates of deaths in different countries. What's going on with that? Why are there so many differences, and what would be behind that? The next episode will look at what is the connection between conflicts of interest with big pharma, with elites like Bill Gates, with people including, Dr. Anthony Fauci. How is he involved in conflicts of interest? And also other elites. We're going to look at that. What effect could that have on this crisis and this fraud? The next installment will look at what are other similar examples of false narratives, such as the measles outbreaks in California and New York State. What's the nexus between that, and the current crisis, so-called, supposed, of the COVID-19? We'll look in the 7th episode at what is the timeline and the significance of the timeline for the outbreak of COVID-19 in these United States. In the final installment, which will be on the commemoration of Good Friday, we'll look at what is the role of the spiritual revival in general, even looking at the revival brought by Jonathan Edwards and his followers, and what is the role specifically of Reverend Sun Myung Moon in the United States. So how is that connected to everything we're talking about? In this first episode, I would like to give a call to action. I will give a call to action. 1, open the country now. President Trump, all governors, rescind immediately these repressive and restrictive guidelines that are based on false or no science. There's no support, that no scientific evidence that social distancing works. Why are we asking all people to stay at home? That's not a traditional method of quarantining people. That's everyone to stay at home. That needs to be rescinded immediately. Secondly, use real data on morbidity and hospital usage versus data showing that data, like how many people are in the hospital now. I was just reading today that, for instance, in New York City, no data is available or reported for how many hospital beds are open or not. Why is that? Use real data showing us really what's going on, and use real data on morbidity. How many people died as of during this time, by this time during the last year and the year before that? Is it more? Is it less? Why can't we have that data? We need that data. Thirdly, expose conflicts of interest. Bring in independent voices like John Ioannidis, who have differing alternate viewpoints and who are not part of the big pharma, big government conglomerate, the vaccine industrial complex. Certainly, Dr. Fauci is a part of that complex. He has huge conflicts of interest. His department has received a huge grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He needs to be removed from that position of being on this coronavirus team. Wrong. He's not the right person for that. Huge conflicts of interest. How can he be in there? Fourthly, include spiritual leaders. Spiritual leaders, of course, every American, but spiritual leaders and all people are affected because these restrictions and guidelines and mandates are restricting freedom of conscience, and they're restricting freedom of worship. And as I said, this is not just an external crisis, but a spiritual crisis. How can you not include spiritual leaders at such a time as this? They need to be included, and they're also directly being impacted by these mandates in many, many states, like not to gather, not to worship. So they must be included. So I hope you continue to join us each day. Do subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also, you can download the podcast from your favorite provider. And the easiest way would be just to go to visionroot, visionroot.org, and you can paste our link for our podcast feed in your favorite podcast service, like Stitcher or Castbox or any other, and you will subscribe to our podcast. And you can also find the transcripts and short articles summarizing this content at visionroot.org. Well, I do thank you for joining us, and I know that together we will not cede our ground to this fraudulent crisis. This is really a spiritual crisis we're having, because the people who have conscience have to rise up. We can never let restrictions of government violate freedom of conscience. That's called tyranny. That's called communism. That's not acceptable. That's not what we're about. That's what our forefathers fought for. and we cannot voluntarily give away our freedoms. So I know we will not. We'll get through this together. Mr. President, rescind your recommendations immediately. Follow your gut. Don't keep doing these bad lockdowns and based on bad data, conflicted people like Anthony Fauci. Bring in some real statisticians like John Ioannidis and others. Look at the real data. Tell us how many people died this year versus last year. How many hospital beds right now being used versus last year. Let's get real data, not this baloney scare data. We'll be examining all these topics, and we are very, very grateful that you have joined us this evening for this podcast and video presentation. I am your host, Rich Urban. This is the Rich Urban Show. We're coming to you from historic Harpersburg, West Virginia. Do be blessed, and we will see you tomorrow. Good night.